From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. And today we're going to be talking about Israel. The country is set to hold elections on April 9th, and this could be the year that we see a major shakeup in Israeli politics. After a decade in power, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces significant headwinds in the form of a strong challenge from the new Blue and White Party and the specter of multiple criminal indictments. To discuss where things stand, I'm joined today by three great guests: Natan Sachs, Amir Tibon, and Grace Wermenbol. Natan is the director of the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Amir is the Washington correspondent for Haaretz newspaper. And Grace is a non-resident scholar here at MEI and a specialist in contemporary Middle Eastern geopolitics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Amir, let's start with you. Can you give us a quick overview of the main players and what's at stake in the elections on April 9th?
Well, the most important factor to understand about Israeli elections is that unlike, here in the United States where there is a two-party system, we have a parliamentary multi-party system. So in the last Knesset, our parliament, I think there were 11 or 12 parties represented. And it's expected that in the next Knesset after this election, we'll also have between 10, 12, maybe 13 parties. The two biggest ones that are competing in this election are Likud, Netanyahu's party, and a new center-right party called Blue and White, which is led by Benny Gantz, a former IDF chief of staff. In recent polling, both of these parties receive around 30 plus seats each. And 30, that's 25% of our parliament, 25% of the Knesset. So together, if you combine them, they are about half. The real drama in this election, in my opinion, is not going to be necessarily which party is bigger, Likud or Blue and White, if one of them gets 30 and the other gets 32, but which parties pass the electoral threshold that we have in our system. If a party gets less than 3.25% of the vote, then all of its votes go to the trash and don't count. And there are many small parties on the right, on the left, in the center, and they will be necessary for forming a coalition. And that's why this is a really interesting and hard to predict election, because you have the two big parties competing, but also really dramatic competition at the bottom around the small parties that get 3, 4, 5 seats.
Natan, what are the major issues for voters in this year's election?
This is an election that every time we say it's unique, this time it's about nothing. This time really does seem to be about very little, except one major thing, which is Benjamin Netanyahu. It's more than in the past, perhaps, a referendum on the prime minister himself. He's in office now 10 years consecutively, and he's already the second longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. He will be the longest serving just this summer. It's really about him. It's about him both in terms of his track record and in terms of just people's basic affinity or antipathy towards him. And of course, the new thing that you mentioned, the charges against him on 3 counts, or 3 cases actually, but several counts, including possibly bribery. The indictment is not yet handed, but it's already been decided by the Attorney General pending a hearing with Netanyahu and his lawyers. This means that Netanyahu and his lawyers will come to speak to the Attorney General himself and try to convince him to change his mind. But bear in mind, the Attorney General has already received all the material of the police investigation, the recommendations by the prosecution, and he made a rather conservative decision based on the cases involved. So never say never. Netanyahu could still get out of this. He's not been indicted and certainly not been convicted yet. But by and large, it doesn't look good for him. So a lot of what we're seeing today, both for voters and equally for the politicians who are sort of jockeying for the day after, everyone's thinking about what happens if the Netanyahu era ends.
Grace, shifting gears a little bit, turnout among Arab Israelis has traditionally been significantly lower than for Jewish Israelis. Do you have a sense of how that will play out this year?
Well, some Palestinian Knesset members have called for a boycott in light of actions and statements perceived as delegitimizing their citizenship. Polls actually do suggest that a majority of Palestinian voters inside Israel, about 80%, believe that precisely because of bills like the nation-state law and the participation of Otzma Yehudit, it is important to vote this time round. And you can also see the same impetus among the Druze minority, which is a community that makes up about 2% of the population. So more than half of their votes are actually predicted to go to Gantz, not in the least because of statements he made that he would challenge the nation-state law and the presence of a Druze woman on the roster who would, if elected, become the first Druze in the Knesset.
Amir, I wanted to circle back to one of the points that Natan made earlier on the corruption charges. How do you see that factoring into voters' decision-making this time around?
So immediately after the Attorney General announced his intention to indict Netanyahu, we did see Likud go a little down in the polls. But I think because of how the news cycle works these days, and Israel is no different than Washington in that regard, stories are forgotten very quickly. New stories and scandals emerge. And I think as we are speaking now, we are more than a month after the Attorney General's announcement. And I think many voters, it's not on the top of their head anymore. They are concerned about other stories that have emerged, rocket attacks from Gaza, threats of violence in the West Bank, political spins and dirt being thrown around by the parties that makes the headlines, Netanyahu's visit to Washington. There are just many other stories that arrive. And I think this is more of a personal view. I actually think the campaign of Blue and White was not good enough in keeping this issue on top of the agenda, in reminding voters again and again and again that Netanyahu is very likely going to be indicted, and that in order to avoid an indictment, he will have to somehow really make a constitutional change in Israel and try to maybe pass a law that protects him from indictment. All these kinds of ideas are floating around the Israeli right wing. As we are speaking right now, it's not the top issue on the agenda, but there are still a few more days until the election, and maybe that will change.
A week is a lifetime in politics, as they say.
In Israeli politics, it's 2 lifetimes.
Grace, switching gears a bit, how important is foreign policy in this election?
Yeah, foreign policy has been quite important. Going into the elections, Netanyahu sought to highlight the ties that he's established both in Africa, with the Gulf, and South America, and has really tried to indicate that Israel, under his leadership, has been able to increase its international standing and also enhance ties with countries, including Muslim-majority countries, as a result of his foreign policy acumen, an area in which his competition has less experience. And then also what we've seen is that Netanyahu has emphasized his close relationship with President Trump in a bid to garner additional votes. So in large billboards, the two can be seen shaking hands with the text, Netanyahu is in another league. And I think this is part of a very conscious decision. Trump is very popular in Israel. Recent polls showed that his popularity is standing at about 65%. And I would add to that the recent ending to the Mueller probe will also be something that Netanyahu is seeking to leverage and draw parallels to his own pending legal issues, in a further attempt to show that the charges he faces and the electoral opposition are part of a kind of a witch hunt led by the left.
Natan, I wanted to bring you in here on the issue of Israeli-U.S. ties specifically. How much of an impact do you really think Netanyahu's kind of selling of his deep, close personal relationship with Trump really matters to voters?
It matters a lot, and I think it matters in 2 ways. First, the United States is very important to Israelis, including ordinary Israelis. And secondly, there's a perception that Trump is very different than previous presidents. It's not that Israelis don't read the news and don't hear about, shall we say, the oddities of the Trump administration or the oddities of his campaign. But if you think of the agenda of this administration, it has been so overtly pro-Israeli and very clearly in line with the preferences of many Israelis, not just right-wingers. So, for example, the embassy move to Jerusalem obviously was done in a way that was very harmful for the peace process and a lot else that can be discussed. But the fundamental fact that Jerusalem, or at least West Jerusalem, is the Israeli capital is sort of as obvious to Israelis as the fact that the sun rises in the east. And the 70-year denial of this by everyone seemed like this enormous hypocrisy, especially when East Jerusalem was often treated as the place for the consulate general, for example, to discuss things with Palestinians. So in that regard, Trump is extremely popular. But moreover, for Netanyahu, if you think about it, for many, many years, he's been the status quo prime minister. He's been very, very cautious on peace, to the consternation of many in America and elsewhere, but actually also on war. He's been a relatively non-warlike prime minister, despite his hawkish rhetoric. But he hasn't had a clear achievement on the international arena besides staving off pressure. The last year and a half or two have given him a clear set of major achievements from his perspective, Jerusalem being number one. But from his perspective, of course, the American withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran deal, now the Golan Heights recognition, and many other steps on the Palestinian arena, for him and his voters are great achievements. So when he has the tagline that he's in a league of his own, even his detractors, I think, have to admit that there are very few other Israelis who could waltz into the Oval Office, get what they want, then hop over to Moscow and march on Victory Day with Putin as a guest of honor in the Red Square and get licensed to attack in Syria, and of course have meetings in Oman and in Africa, etc. So there is some truth to the fact that after so many years, he is one of the most experienced, but qualified in that regard. And that is a major advantage for him going into this campaign.
Grace, on the issue of the U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, I just wanted to kind of drill into that a little more deeply. How important is this regionally and within the context of the election itself?
So practically, the announcement actually, even with a presidential decree, means fairly little. The majority of the international community still considers the Golan Heights occupied Syrian territory and does not recognize Israel's 1981 annexation of the Heights. The announcement, however, does, I think, set a dangerous precedent both for Israel vis-a-vis the West Bank and abroad for nations to claim territories that they have taken by force and claim are theirs to keep. For instance, on Monday, Netanyahu claimed that through this announcement, Trump initiated an important international principle, namely that you can keep occupied territory. Moreover, I'd say that by recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, Trump has very much put the issue center stage when it really wasn't. Since the start of the Syrian civil war, there was really no debate that Israel would engage in peace conversations with the Syrian regime and seize the territory, particularly given the entrenchment of Hezbollah's backer, Iran. In the wake of the announcement, what you've seen is various groups and nations have called for resistance, including Hezbollah. So I'd say that by recognizing Israeli sovereignty, I think Trump has made a non-issue, at least at this point in time, into an issue.
Amir, one of the other key events when it comes to U.S.-Israeli elections is the annual AIPAC conference, which just wrapped up on March 26th. What were your takeaways from that and from Netanyahu's visit to D.C.?
So, first of all, I think the main headlines and political dramas this year at AIPAC were more about American politics than Israeli politics. It was about which Democrats attended and what they chose to say, and the announcements by some Democratic presidential candidates that they won't attend the conference, and the spin that was put on it by Republican Vice President Mike Pence, and also some groups on the left who then said, see, the Democrats are boycotting AIPAC, when in fact that was not true. I mean, some of the candidates who did not arrived to the conference still met with AIPAC delegates in their offices, but you could clearly see there was some movement within the Democratic Party, that there was some response to the pressure coming from left-wing groups not to associate with AIPAC, and that Republicans like Pence and others were trying to use this as a wedge issue, and AIPAC is very concerned about this, because AIPAC is built on bipartisan support, and what AIPAC sells to its supporters, to its donors, is the idea that it's an organization that can work on both sides of the aisle. And they are trying very hard to fix this situation and emphasize that they are working with both parties. I think Netanyahu is not making it any easier for them. When he basically enlists Trump on his re-election campaign and uses Trump in his propaganda materials, and also now there are videos of him using Sean Hannity for his own propaganda and Ted Cruz. And he also put out a video celebrating his confrontations with Barack Obama. Now, if the year was 1994, so yes, you could do this kind of thing, put out this kind of video in Israel, and nobody in Washington except 50 people who work in the field of Middle East punditry would notice it. But in today's social media world, these things fly very fast. And people here are noticing it, and they're seeing that Netanyahu is basically aligning himself 100% with Trump and the Republican Party, and that is going to cause a lot of headaches for AIPAC if he gets reelected. And then we're going into the 2020 campaign.
Yeah, it seems like definitely a longer-term issue that he's managed to turn what has been a pretty broad bipartisan consensus for a very long time into a fairly partisan issue.
He has. I think Amir's exactly right. He's not alone in this. Both things can be true. Netanyahu, I think, is very much a culprit of this story, and especially the fact, if you think about it from a Democrat's perspective, even one who doesn't care tremendously about this issue, here's a foreign prime minister, went to battle against Obama, a president they like, had the audacity to win that fight in the end because the JCPOA America withdrew from it, and of course is now embracing Trump, which for most Democrats is anathema. But of course there are other issues as well. There's demographic changes on both sides. The Republican Party has become much more pro-Israeli than it used to be. It used to be quite hostile to Israel. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in some quarters, but it was not obviously the party of pro-Israel. The Democrats were always that. And you can still see about 2/3 of Jews, even more, vote for Democrats traditionally. On the Democratic side, of course, we also have demographic changes, both in terms of the demographic makeup, but also age differences. The younger groups of Democrats, younger cohorts, are far more or less attuned to the old messages of the pro-Israel community. And in that sense, there are big changes. So this means that Netanyahu is extremely important. The images are very important too. But even if Netanyahu lost, even if Benny Gantz was prime minister very soon, Israel would still have, and Israel supporters like AIPAC would still have a serious problem on their hands that will not be fixed by Netanyahu or even Trump going away. And in that sense, it's a deeper long-term question.
I agree with Natan's analysis. I just want to add, though, that when we talk about the younger voters, for example, Trump is increasingly unpopular among younger Americans. So if Israel already has a challenge with that demographic, and it's true, and it's not because of Netanyahu, it's a deeper issue, but when you already have a challenge with this group, and then the equation Netanyahu equals Israel equals Trump enters the scene, it makes things even more complicated than they are to begin with. Yep.
Grace, shifting gears a little bit, to what extent has the Israeli-Palestinian conflict been a factor in this election?
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has really not taken center stage during these elections. In fact, for Kahol Lavan, their platform doesn't even have a clear diplomatic stance on the conflict, despite the fact that the majority of their voters, about 60%, call for a two-state solution. And instead, they rather vaguely call for the goal of separation without defining what that exactly means. Likud stands on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict under Netanyahu, and particularly since the Trump presidency has also become slightly more ambiguous. I think it's important to remember that during Obama's first term, Netanyahu became the only prime minister to freeze settlement building and the first on the right to publicly accept the two-state solution. And I think that objective has significantly changed from the moment that Obama left office. And now he's talking about giving the Palestinians not necessarily a state, but what he calls a state minus.
Natan, I wanted to ask also about the recent rocket attacks from Gaza and the Israeli response to that. How does that play into Netanyahu's efforts to portray himself as Mr. Security? And has the blue and white party, given its kind of general heavy leadership at the top, managed to kind of mitigate against that at all?
It's a very major issue. If you think about it, rockets, from Gaza, this was north of Tel Aviv. So it means that not only residents nearby Gaza, and there are quite a few of them, Amir is one of them, this is north of Tel Aviv, so that includes most of the Israeli population within this range, are under rocket attack. So irrespective of the conditions inside Gaza, if you imagine Israeli voters under rocket attack, you can rest assured that's very, very high on their priority list. That said, Netanyahu is not held responsible for this condition because Israelis, honestly, with some truth, remember that this is not new, and this is true under every prime minister. Netanyahu has certainly not solved the problem in the last 10 years, to say the least, but he also did not create it. It was created before he became prime minister under Prime Minister Olmert, these specific conditions with Gaza. And so in that regard, Israeli voters don't blame Netanyahu necessarily. If anything, there are attacks from the right on the idea that he has held the status quo instead of striving to bring down and topple Hamas and change fundamentally the equation of this group in Gaza fighting incessantly against a far superior power, Israel, which creates this or enables this endless conflict. Solutions of the other kind, of trying to accommodate or agree, for example, to Palestinian reconciliation, those are far less popular among Israelis that are not really raised. So by and large, when you see this, any kind of violence, any kind of reminder of the security situation usually helps the right because the right is perceived as tougher. That's exactly why blue and white is constructed the way it is. It's an attempt to do old Bill Clinton triangulation, which is if you're tough on something, then I'm going to be just as tough as you on that, and I'll be different on other things. So blue and white is not only led by a general, which has happened in the past for the center and left, but led by 3 former chiefs of staff plus Yair Lapid. And in that sense, they're trying to say Netanyahu may be strong in security, or at least perceived that way, but we among us, and they've said this, have more than 100 years of experience in security, therefore can be trusted on these issues.
Yeah, I would just add that for Netanyahu, the rocket attacks could also be an opportunity precisely because of that. Kahol Lavan and also other government politicians like Lieberman have criticized Netanyahu in the past for being soft on Hamas. So Netanyahu could leverage the most recent escalation to prove his strengths as Mr. Security. However, having said that, I think he will avoid an all-out escalation as he will then face accusations of warmongering for election purposes. So I think it's fair to assume that once he decides that public opinion has been satisfied, he will likely put the brakes on.
Amir, in the kind of home stretch in the final days before the election, are there any kind of key indicators or signs that you'll be watching to get a sense of how things will turn out?
I think the most important thing in Israeli politics, and I think in other countries, but in Israel, is how the candidates appear on television. Everything else, it's nice to talk about on Twitter and exchange kind of ideas. But for example, what Natan and Grace talked about right now, the rockets from Gaza, I think that was very dangerous for Netanyahu. And the reason that he's not seeing a drop in support is because Gantz, on the same day that the rockets were launched from Gaza, had a very bad and unconvincing appearance on Israel's primetime television news. In Israel, the most watched newscasts are not in the morning like in the US, but in the evening. 8 p.m. newscasts are the most watched TV shows in Israel. And he gave an interview from Washington after he spoke at AIPAC that for technical, but also he wasn't well-prepared reasons, was very unconvincing. And I think in that moment, Netanyahu probably breathed a sigh of relief, because the nightmare for Netanyahu would have been rockets launched from Gaza, and then Gantz, the former general, comes and gives a very strong and convincing appearance. And I think in the next few days, as the election gets near, there will be other stories and scandals, and we cannot predict Israeli politics and how they get involved with security and other issues. The candidates who will respond to the events in a more forceful and convincing and security providing kind of way will benefit from the developments more.
Great. I'd like to conclude by quickly running through the kind of two main potential electoral outcomes. First, Netanyahu victory. What do you expect? Is it kind of business as usual? And what sort of cabinet and agenda would you kind of anticipate?
If you think of the two candidates, the policy differences on many foreign policy issues are actually very small. On Iran, on Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, many other issues, Gantz was part of the Netanyahu decision-making process. He's never been a politician, but he was chief of staff and deputy before that. Ashkenazi was chief of staff. Yalon was chief of staff, but also a defense minister under Netanyahu. A lot of similarities. There are two areas where there's some differences, and they're important. One is on the Palestinian arena. The differences are not huge in the sense that Gantz would not go on an enormously leftist approach towards the Palestinians, but he would probably have a very different approach to where the status quo should lead us. The status quo is not static. Under Netanyahu, it's leading in a very particular direction, to my mind, dangerous one. And Gantz, at the very least, has a different conception, probably, of what the end game is. Doesn't mean huge drama in the short term. It does mean that a different management of the status quo. The second area where there'd be a big difference is actually on domestic issues. That's perhaps where the most profound difference between the men is. Netanyahu has used a lot of very divisive rhetoric, sometimes against the minority in Israel, between Jews and Arabs, but also within Jewish society and against many of the institutions, the press, the media, the judiciary very prominently, especially now that he's being perhaps indicted for crimes. That will be a profound difference. If you see Gantz or even a successor to Netanyahu in the Likud, you may see a very different tone that is less divisive and perhaps starts to bring a bit more of the comedy that used to exist a bit more, not to sound nostalgic, but I do think Netanyahu was damaging in that regard. By and large, though, don't expect huge differences. You will see a difference. I think it's important in the long term, but it's more in nuance than in huge top line.
I agree with what Natan said. I think if Netanyahu wins, and right now that looks like the more likely scenario, you never know. He's right now the favorite. The main issue will be the fate of democracy in Israel, because Netanyahu will probably want to pass some kind of law that bars his own indictment, and then he will try to negotiate with the religious and right-wing parties under what terms they would support this kind of legislation. And because he will probably be in a weaker position as prime minister, he will be reliant on his coalition partners, and they would be able to extract a lot of concessions from him when it comes to religious legislation, maybe annexing parts of the West Bank, which is what the right-wing settler parties would want. Another thing maybe they will ask for will be limiting the responsibility of the Supreme Court in Israel, which would be really a constitutional change in the country, because many of the more liberal characteristics of Israel, when we look at gay rights, some feminist decisions over the years, started with the Supreme Court, actually. So limiting the Supreme Court would be a big change in our society. I think that will be the biggest political battle in Israel if Netanyahu constructs his same right-wing religious coalition from last time.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, there was a video put out by Shaked in which one of the things that she highlights in this perfume video is her achievements in curbing Supreme Court powers. And then another thing that I would add is if Netanyahu is able to form a governing coalition, is that because he's pushed this union between the Jewish Home Party and Otzma Yehudit, he's offering them a platform and mainstreaming their politics, because the idea is that they're going to get at least 2 Knesset seats, and if he wins, become part of a governing coalition.
Great. Well, we'll have to see how it all plays out, and we'll have to leave it there for now. But thank you, Grace, Natan, and Amir, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.